Nobody expected Caitlin Clark to break her silence like this. After months of nonstop online noise, subtle jabs, viral debates, and growing disrespect, the most talked-about player in women's basketball finally addressed what everyone else had been arguing about for her. And the moment she did, it sent shockwaves through the internet. Some fans felt validated. Others felt uncomfortable. And a line that had quietly been crossed was suddenly dragged into the open for everyone to see. Because this wasn't just another sports headline. Caitlin Clark's rise didn't feel normal, and that's exactly why everything around her became so intense. One season, she was a college star. The next, she was the face of an entire movement. Sold-out arenas followed her everywhere. TV ratings spiked whenever she played. Even people who had never watched a single women's basketball game suddenly knew her name. That kind of attention doesn't happen quietly. Every shot she took was clipped. Every reaction became a screenshot. Every interview was dissected line by line. She wasn't just playing basketball anymore. She was being watched, analyzed, and judged in real time by millions of people who all believed they understood what her success meant. And that's where the tension started to grow. At first, the conversation stayed focused on her talent, her range, her confidence, her ability to shift momentum with a single play. But as the spotlight got brighter, something changed. Praise slowly turned into comparison. Comparison turned into criticism. And criticism started blending with things that had nothing to do with basketball. Online debates stopped being about stats and highlights. They became about narratives. Some people claimed she was being pushed too hard by the media. Others argued she represented something bigger than the game itself. And then there were voices who used her success as a weapon, attacking other players, dismissing years of work by women who came before her, all while hiding behind the idea of being fans. That's when the situation began to spiral. Caitlin Clark's name started showing up in arguments she never participated in. Her image was being used to justify disrespect toward other athletes. Comment sections turned hostile. And suddenly, her success wasn't just celebrated. It was contested, questioned, and politicized in ways that made the entire conversation uncomfortable. But through all of it, Caitlin stayed silent. No dramatic posts. No defensive interviews. No emotional responses. Just basketball. And that silence became its own story. People began projecting their assumptions onto her. Critics claimed she didn't care. Supporters said she was being smart. Others accused her of benefiting from chaos without addressing it. The longer she stayed quiet, the louder everyone else became, filling the gap with speculation, frustration, and half-formed conclusions. The pressure kept building. Every game she played now carried extra weight. Every expression was analyzed. A smile meant one thing. A serious face meant another. Even moments of focus were misread as attitude. She couldn't exist neutrally anymore. Everything was interpreted through whatever narrative someone already believed. And still, she didn't respond. That restraint frustrated people who wanted drama. It unsettled critics who expected defiance. And it confused fans who assumed silence meant approval of the loudest voices online. In reality, Caitlin was doing the one thing that felt natural to her, staying grounded in the game. But eventually, the conversation reached a point where ignoring it wasn't an option. When Caitlin Clark finally spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't try to control the narrative either. Instead, she did something far more unexpected. She drew a clear boundary. Calmly, directly, without emotion or theatrics. She made it known that disrespect toward other players, especially when done in her name, wasn't something she supported. She didn't dodge the situation. She didn't pretend it wasn't happening. She simply shut down the idea that her success justified anyone else being torn down. That moment hit harder than any argument online, because it forced people to confront something uncomfortable. The chaos surrounding her wasn't created by her words or actions. It was created by what others projected onto her. And once she spoke, those projections didn't disappear. They turned inward. Some praised her maturity. Others accused her of playing it safe. A few claimed she waited too long. And just like that, the backlash evolved. It was no longer just fans arguing in comment sections. Media personalities weighed in. Critics dissected her tone. Analysts debated what she should have said instead. Even people who had never supported her suddenly had opinions on how she handled the situation. Caitlin Clark had stepped into a new role, whether she wanted to or not. She wasn't just a player under scrutiny anymore. She became a reference point, a symbol. a mirror reflecting how divided the conversation around women's basketball had become. And the more composed she remained, the more intense the reactions grew around her. Because calm doesn't satisfy people who want conflict. And what followed next wasn't a resolution, it was an escalation. The backlash didn't fade after she spoke. It sharpened. New accusations surfaced. Old comments were reanalyzed. Every future move she made was now framed through the lens of that moment. And the internet, as always, picked sides, not based on facts, but on feelings. What started as admiration had turned into expectation. What started as success had turned into pressure. And Caitlin Clark found herself standing in the center of a conversation that was no longer just about basketball, but about respect, identity, and what happens when fame grows faster than understanding. And this was only the beginning. Because what happened next pulled in powerful voices, ignited even deeper controversy, and pushed Caitlin into a spotlight she could never fully step out of, no matter how well she played. What made the backlash surrounding Caitlin Clark so unusual wasn't its volume. It was its persistence. Most controversies burn hot and then fade. This one didn't. It lingered, shifted forms, reappeared in different spaces. And every time it resurfaced, it carried a slightly different accusation. That's how narratives survive. One week, the debate centered on media favoritism. The next, it focused on silence. Then it moved to tone. Then timing. Then intention. Each version claimed to be the real issue, but none of them stayed consistent long enough to resolve. And that inconsistency mattered. Because when criticism constantly changes its target, it stops being about accountability and starts revealing discomfort. People weren't reacting to something Caitlin Clark did wrong. They were reacting to the fact that she didn't behave the way they expected someone in her position to behave. She didn't apologize loudly. She didn't explain herself repeatedly. She didn't position herself as a savior or a villain. She stayed neutral, and neutrality infuriated people. In today's online culture, silence isn't seen as restraint. It's interpreted as strategy. And once that assumption took hold, everything Caitlin did was filtered through suspicion. A calm interview became calculated. A brief answer was labeled evasive. Even moments of humility were reinterpreted as branding. The pressure to perform socially began rivaling the pressure to perform athletically. And that's when the conversation crossed into dangerous territory. Instead of discussing basketball, people began questioning her character, her upbringing, her awareness, her responsibility. Expectations were placed on her that went far beyond the court, expectations that no one could meet without making someone else angry. The irony was impossible to ignore. She was being criticized for not controlling fan behavior, by people who couldn't control their own reactions to her restraint. As this cycle continued, something else started happening behind the scenes. Teammates were asked about her in interviews. Opponents were pulled into conversations they never initiated. Even league discussions began circling back to her name, not because she demanded attention, but because attention refused to leave her. That constant focus created tension. Not open conflict, subtle tension. The kind that doesn't explode, but quietly reshapes dynamics. Every matchup featuring Caitlin now carried extra meaning. Fans watched body language. Commentators analyzed interactions. Normal competitiveness was reframed as rivalry. Neutral moments were given emotional weight they never carried in real time. And Caitlin noticed. Not the criticism, the distortion. Because when every action is interpreted through controversy, authenticity becomes harder to protect. The version of you that exists online slowly drifts away from the version you actually are. And once that gap forms, people stop reacting to the person and start reacting to the idea. That's what happened here. Caitlin Clark became less of an athlete and more of a projection. People argued about her without referencing her. They debated her impact without listening to her. And they demanded clarity while refusing nuance. That contradiction fueled the backlash further. But something crucial kept the situation from spiraling completely out of control. She never reacted emotionally. No impulsive statements. No defensive explanations. No social media breakdowns. That absence of drama frustrated critics who were waiting for a misstep. And over time, that frustration began to show. The arguments grew thinner. The accusations less grounded. The outrage more performative. People were running out of substance. And that's when the conversation began to turn on itself. Supporters who had stayed quiet started questioning why the standard applied to Caitlin Clark felt so different. Neutral viewers began noticing how often criticism relied on assumption rather than evidence. Even some critics acknowledged that the backlash felt disproportionate to anything she had actually done. The narrative started cracking. Not because Caitlyn defended herself, but because the criticism couldn't sustain its own weight. And that moment matters, because it reveals something important about modern fame. When someone refuses to engage in outrage, outrage eventually exposes itself. It becomes repetitive, predictable, hollow. And once that happens, people stop listening, not to the person being attacked, but to the attackers themselves. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, quietly, almost invisibly. But by the time people noticed it, the tone had already changed. The conversation wasn't as aggressive. The accusations weren't landing the same way. And the spotlight that once felt hostile began softening into something closer to respect. Not because everyone agreed, but because exhaustion had replaced anger. Caitlyn Clark had outlasted the backlash. Not by winning an argument, not by controlling the narrative, but by refusing to become what critics needed her to be. And that endurance set the stage for what came next. Because while the public argument was losing steam, something deeper was forming. A shift in how players, fans, and the league itself viewed her presence. A realization that her impact wasn't just about numbers or headlines, but about how she handled pressure that would have broken someone less grounded. And that realization didn't come from words. It came from consistency, from showing up, from competing, from letting time expose which reactions were genuine and which were just noise. And as the backlash faded into background static, a new phase began. One that would redefine Caitlyn Clark's role in the sport entirely, and force even her harshest critics to reconsider what they thought they knew. By the time the backlash began to lose its edge, something else had already changed beneath the surface. The conversation around Caitlyn Clark wasn't just quieter, it was different, less reactive, more observant. People weren't arguing as loudly anymore. They were watching, and that shift mattered. Inside the league, Caitlyn's presence had started to reshape the atmosphere in ways that weren't obvious on highlight reels. Games involving her felt heavier, louder, charged, not because of hostility, but because of expectation. Every arena she walked into buzzed with a kind of energy that hadn't existed before, anticipation mixed with curiosity. Teammates felt it, opponents felt it, the league felt it, but no one talked about it directly. Instead, it showed up in subtleties. Longer media scrums after games. Questions that circled back to her even when she wasn't the topic. Matchups that suddenly carried storylines fans invented in real time. Normal competitiveness began to feel symbolic, as if every possession represented something larger than the scoreboard. That's where rivalries were born. Not dramatic, headline-grabbing feuds, quieter ones. The kind that form when players are constantly compared whether they want to be or not. When performances are measured against a standard that didn't exist a year earlier. And when attention lands unevenly, even if no one openly complains about it. Some players leaned into it. Others resisted it. Most just kept playing. But the tension was there. Not anger, awareness. Because Caitlyn Clark's presence had changed the economics of attention. Games were being watched more closely. Mistakes were amplified. Successes were magnified. And players who had spent years building their careers suddenly found themselves being introduced to new audiences through comparisons rather than accomplishments. That adjustment wasn't easy. Yet Caitlyn never positioned herself above anyone else. She didn't claim ownership of the spotlight. She didn't demand recognition. And she didn't frame herself as the reason attention had shifted. In interviews, she deflected praise. On the court, she competed without theatrics. In the locker room, she stayed grounded. That consistency earned something rare. Respect, even from those who didn't benefit from the spotlight she brought. Slowly, the narrative around her began to change again. Not because critics disappeared, but because their arguments felt outdated. While people debated her impact online, the league itself was moving forward. Attendance numbers were holding. Viewership wasn't dipping. Interest wasn't fading. The momentum was real. And Caitlyn Clark was still at the center of it, without ever asking to be. Fans noticed this before commentators did. They saw how opposing arenas filled up when she came to town. They saw how younger players talked about watching her. They noticed how often cameras followed her, not because of controversy, but because of curiosity. People wanted to understand her. Not the symbol, not the narrative, the person. That curiosity softened the edges of the backlash. It replaced accusation with observation. And observation led to something unexpected: empathy. Viewers began recognizing how difficult it was to exist under that level of scrutiny without breaking character, without snapping, without becoming defensive. Most people wouldn't handle it well. That realization didn't excuse criticism, but it reframed it. The question stopped being, "Why won't she say more?" and became, "How is she handling this so calmly?" That question lingered, because calm is disarming in a culture addicted to reaction. As weeks passed, Caitlyn's influence became harder to deny. Not just statistically, but atmospherically. She made the game feel urgent again. Not dramatic, meaningful. And that feeling extended beyond wins and losses. Young fans showed up early just to watch warm-ups. Families stayed longer after games. Conversations shifted from controversy back to basketball. That didn't erase the past tension, it absorbed it. And with that absorption came a turning point. The same critics who once demanded louder statements now found themselves without leverage. The outrage they relied on no longer landed. The audience had moved on. Not because they stopped caring, but because they started seeing the situation more clearly. Caitlin Clark wasn't avoiding responsibility. She was refusing to perform outrage. That distinction changed everything. And while she never publicly acknowledged that shift, her actions reflected it. She looked more comfortable, more settled, less burdened by external noise. On the court, her confidence sharpened. Off the court, her presence felt lighter. She hadn't escaped the spotlight. She had learned how to stand in it without being consumed. And that skill, more than any highlight, defined her next chapter. Because what followed wasn't about backlash or media debates anymore. It was about legacy, about expectations, about what happens when a player survives the storm and steps into something more permanent, something that lasts longer than controversy. And that's where the story takes another turn. Because once the noise faded, Caitlin Clark was finally seen for who she actually was, not by everyone, but by enough people to matter. And that visibility would shape everything that came next. Once the backlash quieted, Caitlin Clark didn't get relief. She got weight. The kind of weight that doesn't come from criticism, but from expectation. When people stop doubting you, they start demanding more. And that shift can be just as heavy, if not heavier, than open negativity. The conversation around Caitlin had changed tone again. She was no longer being questioned as loudly. Instead, she was being measured, compared, positioned. Her performances weren't just evaluated on their own anymore. They were stacked against what people believed she should be doing by now. That's a dangerous place for any athlete. Because expectations don't ask whether you're ready. They assume you are. Every game became a test of consistency. A good performance was expected. A great performance was required. Anything less sparked disappointment instead of understanding. The margin for error shrank, even as the spotlight stayed fixed. And Caitlin felt it. Not as pressure to prove herself, she'd already done that, but as pressure to maintain an image that was still forming in the public mind. She was no longer just Caitlin Clark, the player. She was Caitlin Clark, the standard. And standards don't get grace. What made this phase different from the backlash was how subtle it was. No loud outrage. No viral arguments. Just quiet judgment. A missed shot became a storyline. A tough night sparked questions about regression. Normal fluctuations in performance were framed as warning signs. That framing followed her everywhere. In interviews, questions shifted from curiosity to expectation. Instead of asking how she felt about her journey, people asked what she planned to deliver next. Instead of celebrating milestones, conversations focused on what she hadn't done yet. The goalposts kept moving. And while Caitlin never publicly pushed back against that pressure, her approach subtly changed. Not in personality, but in presence. She became more intentional, more selective, less reactive to external praise or criticism. She understood something most people don't realize until it's too late. If you let expectations define you, you lose control of your own pace. So she didn't. Instead of chasing validation, she leaned into preparation. Instead of feeding narratives, she focused on rhythm. Instead of engaging with comparisons, she stayed anchored to her own process. That decision didn't make headlines, but it mattered. Because it allowed her to grow without performing growth for an audience. It allowed her to evolve without constantly explaining herself. And it protected something essential that many athletes lose once they become household names. Authenticity. Fans began noticing this shift, even if they couldn't articulate it. Caitlyn felt more grounded, less eager to please, more comfortable existing without commentary. And that comfort signaled something important. She wasn't just surviving the spotlight anymore. She was settling into it. That transition marked the beginning of a new phase, one where Caitlyn Clark stopped being discussed as a phenomenon and started being evaluated as a fixture. Someone whose presence wasn't surprising anymore, but expected. And expectation changes everything. Because once someone becomes a fixture, their legacy begins forming in real time. Every season adds context. Every decision carries long-term implications. And every response, or lack of response, contributes to how they'll eventually be remembered. Caitlyn understood this intuitively. She didn't rush statements. She didn't chase moments. She didn't try to control perception. She let time do the work. That patience frustrated some people. Others found it refreshing. But no one could deny it was effective. The noise around her continued to fade, replaced by something steadier, respect. Not universal, not unconditional, but earned. And as that respect solidified, a realization spread quietly through the league and its audience. Caitlyn Clark wasn't just influencing conversations anymore. She was influencing standards. How players were evaluated. How rookies were compared. How attention was distributed. Her presence raised the bar, not intentionally, but inevitably. And that kind of influence doesn't come without consequence. Because when you raise the bar, you also become the reference point, the comparison, the benchmark others measure themselves against, whether they want to or not. That role would bring its own challenges. Challenges Caitlyn hadn't faced yet. Because while controversy tests composure and expectation tests consistency, the next phase would test something far more personal. Identity. Who she was becoming, and who people needed her to be, were no longer guaranteed to align. And that tension was about to surface. There's a moment every highly visible athlete reaches where the applause fades just enough for self-awareness to set in. Not doubt, awareness. The realization that the version of you the world talks about isn't the same version that wakes up every morning and goes to work. That moment came quietly for Caitlyn Clark. By now, she was respected. That much was clear. The outrage had cooled. The debates had softened. The league had adjusted to her presence. But something else replaced the noise: interpretation. People felt comfortable defining her again, just in a different way. She was called composed, professional, built for pressure. All compliments. But none of them told the full story. Because composure isn't absence of feeling. It's control of it. And control takes energy. Energy that most people never see being spent. Caitlyn was still navigating expectations that didn't belong to her alone. She was still being framed as an example. Sometimes positive, sometimes symbolic, sometimes convenient. The difference now was that those expectations were quieter, more polished, and harder to push back against. No one demanded statements anymore. They expected consistency. And consistency can become a cage if you're not careful. Every calm response reinforced the idea that she was unshakable. Every measured answer strengthened the belief that pressure didn't affect her. Over time, that perception created distance, not between her and fans, but between understanding and reality. Because strength, when constantly assumed, stops being acknowledged. There were moments Caitlyn wanted to speak freely. Moments she wanted to clarify things that had been misunderstood months earlier. But she understood something crucial. Once you break character, even for honesty, people don't always hear the truth. They hear deviation. And deviation invites speculation. So she stayed steady. That decision protected her image, but it complicated her identity. Not in a dramatic way, in a slow, internal one. The kind that doesn't explode but lingers. The kind that asks questions without demanding answers. Who am I becoming in all of this? Am I choosing this version of myself? Or am I maintaining it for everyone else? Those questions didn't show up in interviews. They didn't surface in headlines. But they shaped how Caitlyn approached the game, the media, and herself. She became more private. Not distant, intentional. She chose words carefully. She avoided emotional extremes. She focused on preparation and performance because those were the spaces she could control. And control mattered more now than ever. Because once you're understood incorrectly long enough, correcting the narrative feels riskier than living inside it. Fans sensed this shift too, even if they couldn't articulate it. Caitlyn felt more reserved, less reactive. Not colder, clearer. The spotlight hadn't dimmed, but her relationship with it had changed. She no longer tried to meet it halfway. She let it orbit her instead. That adjustment preserved her energy. But it also created a quiet misunderstanding. Some people assumed she didn't care as deeply. Others thought she had mastered the art of detachment. A few believed she had fully embraced the role she'd been assigned. None of them were fully right. Caitlin still cared. Deeply. About the game. About fairness. About respect. About how her presence affected others. Even when that impact wasn't her intention. But she also understood that caring publicly came with consequences. And that understanding forced her to make choices that weren't always satisfying, but were necessary. That tension between authenticity and perception became her new challenge. Not something to defeat, but something to manage. And the way she managed it quietly reshaped how people engaged with her. They stopped expecting emotional transparency. They stopped demanding reactions. They accepted her boundaries. And acceptance, even imperfect acceptance, brought stability. Yet stability has its own cost. Because once things settle, people begin asking different questions. Not who is she, but how long will she last? Not can she handle pressure, but can she sustain this level indefinitely? Those questions marked the beginning of another transition. One that had nothing to do with controversy or criticism. Everything to do with longevity. And longevity would test Caitlin Clark in ways Backlash never could. Because staying visible is one thing. Staying relevant without losing yourself is another. And that was the next chapter waiting quietly ahead. Longevity doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives quietly, disguised as expectation. By the time Caitlin Clark entered this phase of her career, the chaos that once surrounded her had mostly dissolved into background noise. The loud criticism faded. The viral debates slowed. The constant reaction cycles burned themselves out. What remained was something far more demanding: permanence. She wasn't a storyline anymore. She was infrastructure. The league adjusted around her presence. Schedules, broadcasts, promotions, all built with the assumption that Caitlin Clark would be there, performing at a level people had grown accustomed to. And while that kind of trust looks flattering from the outside, inside it carries an unspoken message. You don't get days off anymore. Not physically, mentally. Every game now came with an invisible requirement: stability. Fans didn't just want highlights. They wanted reassurance. They wanted to feel like the standard they'd come to expect wasn't slipping. That demand didn't come in angry comments or viral clips. It came in silence. Silence when she played well. Concern when she didn't. Because consistency removes surprise. And without surprise, people only notice deviation. Caitlin understood this better than most. She knew that longevity wasn't about staying perfect. It was about surviving scrutiny long enough that imperfection didn't define you. That awareness changed how she approached everything. She stopped reacting to short-term narratives entirely. A tough game didn't require explanation. A hot streak didn't require celebration. She treated both as temporary, because she knew attention magnifies extremes, and extremes burn energy. Energy became her most protected resource. Not because she was fragile, but because she was strategic. Caitlin learned how to compartmentalize in ways most people never have to. The court became the place where she released intensity. Everywhere else, she conserved it. She limited exposure. She shortened answers. She created routines that insulated her from the emotional spikes that fame creates. Those routines weren't visible to fans, but they were essential. Because burnout rarely announces itself loudly. It creeps in through repetition. Through being on at all times, through the pressure to represent something larger than yourself without ever consenting to that role. Caitlin didn't resist that pressure. She managed it. She understood that people weren't just watching her play, they were watching her endure. Every calm response reinforced the idea that she was built for this. Every composed performance raised the expectation even higher. And expectations compound. What once felt like support began to feel like reliance. The league didn't just benefit from her presence, it leaned on it. Ratings stabilized around her. Attention followed her. Conversations returned to her. That kind of influence is powerful. But power without boundaries becomes exhausting. Caitlin felt that exhaustion not as stress, but as vigilance. The constant need to maintain equilibrium. The awareness that even neutral actions could be interpreted. The responsibility to avoid becoming a distraction when so many people depended on her consistency. She became careful, not cautious. There's a difference. Caution avoids risk. Carefulness manages it. Caitlyn still played with confidence, still took bold shots, still competed aggressively. But off the court, she was deliberate. She understood that every word she released into the world carried weight she couldn't retrieve. So she limited release. That decision frustrated some fans. They wanted access, insight, personality. But Caitlyn understood something crucial about longevity. The more you give, the more people feel entitled to. And entitlement erodes sustainability. She protected her interior world fiercely. Friends, family, routine, silence. These weren't luxuries, they were armor. They allowed her to show up fully where it mattered without dissolving everywhere else. That discipline paid off. As seasons passed, Caitlyn's presence stopped feeling volatile. She became the calm center of a constantly shifting environment. New players entered. Storylines rotated. Trends changed. And through it all, she remained. Not flashy. Not loud. Reliable. Reliability is boring to highlight reels, but essential to legacy. And legacy began forming whether she acknowledged it or not. Analysts stopped asking whether she could handle pressure and started discussing how long she could maintain this level. Coaches referenced her mindset. Younger players modeled her preparation. Fans stopped questioning her place in the game. She wasn't chasing relevance anymore. She was defining it. But defining relevance comes with its own cost. Because once you become the standard, you stop being allowed to evolve quietly. Any change in behavior is questioned. Any shift in tone is examined. Growth becomes something you have to justify. Caitlyn recognized this danger early. So she stayed anchored to the simplest truth she had. She didn't owe permanence to anyone. Longevity wasn't about being everything forever. It was about staying true long enough to exit on her own terms, whenever that moment eventually came. That realization brought her a sense of calm that outsiders mistook for detachment. It wasn't detachment. It was clarity. And that clarity prepared her for the next inevitable test, one no amount of composure could fully shield her from: the pressure for access. Because the longer you endure, the more people believe they deserve more of you. And Caitlyn Clark was about to decide just how much of herself she was willing to give. Fame doesn't just want your performance. It wants your presence. By the time Caitlyn Clark reached this stage, the demands around her had changed again. She wasn't being asked to prove herself anymore. She wasn't being challenged to respond to criticism. She was being asked quietly, persistently, to give more. More interviews, more insight, more personality, more access. And access is the most dangerous currency in modern sports. Because once people feel close to you, they feel entitled to you. They stop seeing you as a person who performs a job and start seeing you as something they're owed. Caitlyn felt that shift immediately. Media requests increased, not in urgency but in volume. Every outlet wanted her perspective. Every segment wanted her reaction. Every platform wanted her voice attached to whatever topic was trending that week. It wasn't malicious. It was opportunistic. An opportunity, when unchecked, turns into pressure. The expectation wasn't that she say something wrong. It was that she say something. Silence, once interpreted as composure, was now framed as distance. Privacy was mistaken for aloofness. Boundaries were questioned instead of respected. That's when Caitlyn had to make a decision. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Internally. How much of herself was she willing to trade for relevance? Because overexposure doesn't arrive all at once. It sneaks in through small compromises. One extra interview. One unnecessary explanation. One emotional moment shared for the sake of relatability. Those moments add up. Caitlyn had watched this happen to others. Athletes who blurred the line between access and authenticity until there was no line left. Players who became consumed by narratives they once controlled. She refused to follow that path. Instead, she drew boundaries quietly, consistently, and without apology. She shortened responses. She avoided speculative questions. She redirected conversations back to basketball. To some, that felt cold. To Caitlyn, it felt necessary. Because she understood something fundamental about longevity. The more available you are, the less sustainable your presence becomes. Access creates immediacy, but distance creates durability. And Caitlyn chose durability. That choice didn't make headlines, but it changed how people interacted with her. Interviews became more focused. Questions became more respectful. The expectation of emotional transparency slowly dissolved. Not because the media stopped asking, but because Caitlyn stopped feeding. She never said, "I won't talk about this." She simply didn't. That restraint frustrated some outlets. Others adapted. And over time, the tone shifted again, not toward confrontation but toward acceptance. This is who she is. That acceptance was a victory few people noticed. Because reclaiming control doesn't look like power. It looks like restraint. And restraint in a culture obsessed with access is radical. Fans reacted differently. Some missed the openness. Others respected the discipline. Many didn't notice the change consciously. They just felt it. Caitlyn seemed more protected. More settled. Less exposed. That protection mattered. Because once boundaries are set, something else becomes possible. Focus. Without the constant pull of explanation and reaction, Caitlyn's relationship with the game deepened. She played with greater clarity. She moved with intention. She trusted her instincts more fully. The court became her only public language. And that language was enough. People stopped demanding commentary because performance answered questions more effectively than words ever could. Caitlyn didn't need to explain her mindset. It showed in how she competed. She didn't need to defend her character. It revealed itself in consistency. That shift rebalanced the relationship between her and the audience. They watched again, not dissected. And in that space, something rare emerged. Mutual respect. Not agreement. Not idolization. Respect. Respect for boundaries. Respect for process. Respect for the reality that greatness doesn't require constant explanation. That respect created room for Caitlyn to breathe, and for the narrative to mature. She was no longer reacting to the world. She was existing within it, on her own terms. But boundaries don't eliminate pressure. They change its shape. Because once you limit access, the next demand emerges, not for words, but for outcomes. Results. Championships. Legacy-defining moments. The conversation shifted again. Not, who is Caitlyn Clark? But, what will she leave behind? And that question carries weight no boundary can block. Because legacy doesn't ask permission. It arrives when the world decides it's time to measure you. And Caitlyn Clark was approaching that moment. Not as someone scrambling to define herself, but as someone ready to be judged by what she'd built, not what she'd explained. And that judgment would come soon. Quietly. Inevitably. Unavoidably. There comes a point in every great athlete's career when the future stops being the focus. Not because the journey is over, but because people begin measuring what's already happened. That moment doesn't arrive with ceremony. It arrives with silence. For Caitlyn Clark, that silence was noticeable. Not empty, reflective. The debates had cooled. The media frenzy had steadied. The endless demand for explanation had given way to something heavier. Assessment. People weren't asking what she might become anymore. They were asking what she already was. And that shift changes everything. Because when potential turns into legacy, every moment carries different weight. Wins aren't just wins, they're added to a body of work. Losses aren't just setbacks, they're framed as turning points. Normal seasons become chapters in a story others believe they're qualified to interpret. Caitlyn felt this change immediately. Not as pressure to do more, but as pressure to define meaning. Every performance now felt like evidence. Every decision became context. The question wasn't whether she could succeed. It was how she would be remembered. And memory is ruthless. It simplifies. It edits. It chooses what survives. Caitlyn understood that she couldn't control how people would eventually talk about her career. But she also knew she could influence what they'd have to work with. So she focused on substance over spectacle. She stayed consistent. She avoided chasing moments. She trusted that real impact doesn't need to announce itself. That trust wasn't naive, it was informed. She had seen how careers get flattened into headlines, how nuance gets erased, how athletes become myths that no longer resemble the people they were. And she refused to play into that machine, not by rebelling, by remaining steady. That steadiness frustrated those who wanted drama, but it reassured those who valued integrity. Slowly, the conversation around her matured. Analysts discussed her influence instead of her reactions. Fans debated her impact instead of her personality. The narrative had grown up, and so had she. Caitlyn began to carry herself differently, not heavier, but more anchored. She didn't rush through seasons. She didn't treat moments as final or defining. She allowed time to do what time does best, reveal patterns. And patterns tell the truth better than any statement ever could. Over time, those patterns became impossible to ignore. Her consistency, her discipline, her ability to endure scrutiny without fracturing, her refusal to let controversy dictate her pace. Those weren't accidents. They were choices. And choices are what legacies are built on. People began referencing her career in broader conversations about the sport. Not as a trend, but as a reference point. Younger players measured themselves against her style. Commentators used her as a benchmark for mental endurance. Coaches pointed to her approach as proof that preparation outlasts hype. Caitlin Clark had become a standard. Not because she declared herself one, but because the sport needed one. That realization didn't inflate her ego. It clarified her responsibility. Not to carry the league, but to remain honest in how she carried herself within it. And honesty became her quiet signature. She didn't exaggerate success. She didn't dramatize struggle. She let both exist. That balance shaped how people remembered her moments. Big performances felt earned, not inflated. Tough nights felt human, not alarming. Her career began to resemble something rare in modern sports, a long arc rather than a highlight reel. But even long arcs have turning points. And Caitlin knew that memory isn't formed only by consistency. It's formed by moments people return to, moments they replay, moments they argue about long after the game is over. She didn't chase those moments, but she knew they were coming. Because when you stay long enough, moments eventually find you. And the next phase of her journey would be defined not by controversy or endurance, but by the weight of those moments when everything slows down and history decides whether to remember you kindly. That phase would demand more than composure. It would demand choice. What to lean into, what to walk away from, what kind of story she was willing to let people tell. And Caitlin Clark was closer than ever to that crossroads. Defining moments don't always look dramatic while they're happening. Sometimes they look ordinary. A possession, a decision, a pause. But later, those moments become the ones people point to and say, that's when it changed. Caitlin Clark entered this phase with a strange advantage. She understood that moment before it arrived. She knew that the next chapters of her career wouldn't be about proving anything new. They would be about alignment, about whether her actions continued to match the values she'd quietly built over time. And alignment is harder than ambition, because ambition pushes you forward. Alignment asks you to choose carefully. Every opportunity now came with hidden trade-offs. Bigger platforms, louder moments, invitations that promised exposure but demanded narrative compromise. The kind of offers that sound harmless until you realize they shift how people see you. Caitlin evaluated those choices with a discipline that surprised even people close to her. Not every yes was worth the cost. She passed on moments others would have chased. Not because she didn't want attention, but because she didn't want distortion. She understood that legacy isn't built by being everywhere. It's built by being consistent. That restraint created defining moments in unexpected ways. Not through spectacle, but through absence. The moments she declined. The arguments she didn't join. The statements she never made. Those silences spoke louder than most performances. And fans began noticing. Not consciously, intuitively. They noticed how rarely she chased headlines. How little she reacted to provocation. How her biggest games felt grounded instead of theatrical. Those qualities made her moments feel authentic, not manufactured for impact. Authenticity has gravity. It pulls people in slowly, but it keeps them there. The games themselves began to carry different energy. Not just because of stakes, but because of presence. Caitlin played with a calm intensity that steadied everyone around her. Teammates trusted her. Opponents respected her. Crowds felt the balance she brought into the space. Those weren't just performances. They were statements. Statements that said, this is how I play under pressure. Statements that said, this is who I am when it matters. And those statements stacked quietly. As the season progressed, conversations shifted again. Not to controversy, not to debate, but to inevitability. People stopped asking whether Caitlin Clark would leave a mark. They asked how large that mark would be. And inevitability is a dangerous place. Because once people assume greatness, the burden shifts from creation to confirmation. Every big moment becomes a referendum. Every mistake becomes amplified. The room for experimentation disappears. Caitlin felt that pressure, but she didn't fight it. She narrowed her focus even further. She stopped thinking in seasons and started thinking in principles. How she prepared, how she competed, how she treated people when things went wrong, how she responded when things went right. Those principles became her anchor at the crossroads. and crossroads arrived more often now. Stay aggressive or slow the game down. Take control or trust the system. Speak up or let actions answer. Each choice shaped how moments were remembered. And Caitlyn chose consistency every time. That choice didn't make every moment perfect, but it made them honest. And honesty ages well. Long after hype fades, people return to what felt real. That's why defining moments aren't always the loudest. They're the ones that hold up under time. Caitlyn's defining moments weren't isolated highlights. They were patterns. The way she handled pressure repeatedly. The way she stayed grounded when others leaned into chaos. The way she refused to let any single moment redefine her. Those patterns formed a narrative stronger than any single performance. And slowly, almost without announcement, Caitlyn Clark crossed an invisible line. She stopped being judged as a current star. She started being discussed as a future reference. What would Caitlyn have done here? How does this compare to Caitlyn's approach? Does this moment measure up? Those questions meant her legacy was no longer theoretical. It was active. And active legacies bring a new kind of challenge: preservation. How do you continue evolving without fracturing what people already believe about you? How do you remain human without diminishing the standard others now attach to your name? Those questions didn't demand immediate answers. But they waited. And Caitlyn knew they would define the final stretch of her journey. Not in how she played, but in how she chose to grow. Because at this level, growth isn't about adding. It's about refining. And refinement would be her next test. By the time Caitlyn Clark reached this stage, something subtle had changed again. Not in how she played, but in how she was felt. She no longer commanded attention. She shaped it. There's a difference. Early in a career, attention follows momentum. Later, it follows meaning. And Caitlyn had crossed that threshold without ceremony. People didn't rush to watch her because of controversy or curiosity anymore. They watched because her presence gave the game structure. She made moments feel grounded. That grounding came from refinement. Not reinvention. Not transformation. Refinement. She didn't add flash to her game. She removed excess. Her movements became more efficient. Her decisions sharper. Her rhythm steadier. She played with the kind of confidence that doesn't need validation. And that confidence changed how others responded to her. Teammates leaned into her steadiness. Not because she demanded leadership, but because she provided it naturally. She didn't dominate conversations. She didn't impose direction. She modeled it. That style of leadership is quiet and rare, because it doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself over time. You could see it in how teammates trusted her late in games, in how younger players watched her preparation without being told to, in how pressure moments didn't fracture communication, they clarified it. Caitlyn didn't need to be the loudest voice. Her presence did the work, and that presence reshaped her influence. She stopped being the center of every storyline and became the stabilizer within them. When games grew chaotic, she slowed them down. When narratives tried to overtake reality, her consistency brought things back into focus. That role isn't glamorous, but it's powerful, because it allows others to grow around you. Opponents felt it too. Playing against Caitlyn no longer felt like confronting a rising star. It felt like facing a system. Someone who understood timing, momentum, and pressure at a deeper level. That understanding comes from experience, from staying long enough to see patterns repeat, from surviving cycles of hype and criticism, from learning when to press and when to wait. Caitlyn had internalized all of it, and that internalization changed the way people talked about her, not with urgency, but with certainty. Analysts stopped speculating about her ceiling. They discussed her range. Coaches stopped preparing for moments. They prepared for presence. She had become dependable in the most meaningful way. But refinement doesn't mean comfort. It demands restraint. Caitlyn resisted the urge to expand her influence beyond what felt authentic. She didn't seek dominance. She didn't chase narrative control. She allowed others to shine, understanding that leadership doesn't require ownership. That decision protected the ecosystem around her. And ecosystems matter more than stars. Because stars burn bright, but ecosystems endure. Her influence spread quietly. Players adopted her approach. Teams referenced her discipline. Conversations about pressure began to include her name not as a warning, but as an example. How she handled that situation. The way she stayed composed. The consistency she maintained. Those phrases marked a new level of impact. Not momentary. Foundational. And foundation building is invisible until it's tested. Caitlyn's foundation was tested in moments where things didn't go her way. Tough stretches, unexpected losses, nights where nothing flowed. And in those moments, she didn't retreat or dramatize. She stayed. She trusted the process she'd refined. That trust reinforced the perception that she wasn't just talented, she was durable. And durability is what turns influence into legacy. Because legacy isn't built by peaks alone. It's built by survival, by staying intact while everything else shifts, by allowing others to rise without losing your center, by refining who you are without abandoning where you came from. Caitlin Clark was doing all of that quietly. And the quiet mattered, because it prepared her for the final transformation. The moment when influence becomes inheritance. When your presence doesn't just shape games, it shapes how the game is played after you. That moment doesn't announce itself. It waits. And Caitlin was closer to it than anyone realized. There's a moment in every truly influential career when the spotlight stops following the person and starts following the effect they leave behind. Caitlin Clark was entering that moment. Not because she had stepped away. Not because her performance had faded. But because her presence had become embedded. The game no longer felt the same without her influence shaping it. That's how inheritance begins. Inheritance isn't about passing something down intentionally. It happens when behaviors are copied without permission, when standards shift quietly, when players enter the league already measuring themselves against someone they've never met. Caitlin didn't announce this transition. She didn't acknowledge it publicly, but it was happening all around her. You could see it in how younger players talked about preparation, not in dramatic terms, but in disciplined ones, in how calm was valued over flash, in how composure under pressure became a skill people actively tried to develop instead of something assumed. That didn't come from speeches. It came from observation. People watched how Caitlin carried herself during storms and during silence. They noticed how she never chased validation and never weaponized attention. Over time, those patterns became reference points. This is how you survive the spotlight. This is how you stay grounded. This is how you let the game speak. Those lessons didn't belong to Caitlin alone anymore. They belonged to the culture she helped shape. And culture moves slower than controversy, but it lasts longer. As seasons passed, Caitlin's name stopped appearing only in immediate analysis. It began surfacing in broader conversations about the evolution of the sport, not as a comparison point for stats, but as a marker of change. Before Caitlin, after Caitlin, those distinctions didn't exaggerate her role, they contextualized it. She arrived at a moment when the sport was ready to expand, but hadn't yet stabilized. Attention was volatile. Conversations were fragmented. Standards were inconsistent. And through it all, Caitlin provided something rare. Continuity. She didn't reinvent the game. She didn't claim ownership over its growth. She simply stayed consistent long enough for others to build around her. That consistency gave fans something to trust, gave players something to measure against, gave the league a steady presence during a period of rapid change. And trust is the foundation of inheritance. Because people don't inherit moments. They inherit habits. The habit of staying composed. The habit of preparation over performance. The habit of letting time do the work. Caitlin embodied those habits so fully that they stopped being associated only with her. They became part of the game's identity. That's when influence outgrows visibility. And Caitlin noticed this shift, not with pride, but with awareness. She understood that once your influence becomes structural, you're no longer just responsible for yourself. You become a reference, and references carry weight. She approached that weight with the same restraint that had guided her through every phase before. No grand declarations, no claims of impact, just continued discipline. That discipline ensured that her influence wouldn't collapse under scrutiny. It wouldn't be tied to one season or one moment. It would stretch quietly into the future. Even conversations about leadership began changing. Leadership wasn't framed as dominance anymore. It wasn't about volume or visibility. It was about steadiness. That reframing mattered, because it made room for different kinds of greatness. It allowed players to lead without performing. It normalized calm in spaces once dominated by chaos. Caitlin didn't demand that change. She demonstrated it. And demonstration is the most powerful form of teaching. As time moved forward, people began asking questions not about Caitlin's next milestone, but about her long-term imprint. What would remain after the noise faded completely? What would people still reference when her highlights stopped circulating daily? The answer was already visible. Her approach, her consistency, her refusal to let attention distort her identity. Those weren't temporary traits. They were transferable. And transferability is what turns influence into inheritance. Caitlin Clark's career was no longer being tracked only by what she achieved, but by what she normalized. What she made possible for others by showing that endurance didn't require erasure of self. That realization didn't close her story. It deepened it. Because once inheritance begins, a new question emerges, one that no athlete can avoid forever. How do you eventually step back without unraveling what you helped build? Caitlin wasn't there yet, but she could see the horizon. And that horizon would introduce the most complex challenge of all, timing. Timing is the one thing no athlete ever truly controls. You can control preparation. You can control effort. You can control discipline. But timing moves on its own schedule. Caitlin Clark understood this long before anyone started asking questions about what came next. Not because she was planning an exit, but because longevity teaches awareness. When you stay long enough, you begin to feel shifts before they become obvious to everyone else. The shift wasn't in her body. It wasn't in her performance. It was in the rhythm of attention. Moments no longer surprised her. Pressure no longer spiked. Everything felt steady. And steadiness is the first signal that transition is coming. Not transition out, transition within. Caitlin began approaching her role with a longer lens. Decisions weren't just about the next game or the next season. They were about sustainability, about preserving the parts of herself that existed outside the spotlight. Because the hardest transition for elite athletes isn't retirement. It's identity. Who are you when the world stops asking daily questions about your relevance? Who are you when performance is no longer your loudest language? Caitlin didn't wait for those questions to be forced on her. She prepared quietly. She diversified her focus without distracting from the game. She invested energy into relationships that didn't revolve around basketball. She protected routines that grounded her outside competition. She treated privacy not as withdrawal, but as balance. None of this was visible to fans. That was the point. Preparation for transition doesn't happen publicly. If it does, it becomes spectacle, and spectacle complicates detachment. Caitlin avoided that trap entirely. She didn't hint. She didn't tease. She didn't position herself as more than an athlete while still living fully as one. She understood that you don't need to announce evolution. You embody it. That embodiment showed up subtly. In how she spoke about the game, with appreciation instead of urgency. In how she handled wins, with gratitude instead of hunger. In how she approached losses, with perspective instead of frustration. Those weren't signs of decline. They were signs of integration. The game had become part of her, not her entirety. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because athletes who never separate identity from performance struggle when attention shifts. Caitlin didn't allow that fusion to happen. She maintained distance, not from the sport, but from the idea that the sport defined her worth. That mental separation created freedom. Freedom to play without fear of finality. Freedom to exist without constant validation. Freedom to imagine a future without feeling like it threatened the present. And imagination is essential for healthy transition. Not because it signals departure, but because it prevents desperation. Caitlin didn't play like someone clinging to relevance. She played like someone secure in it. And that security changed how moments felt. There was less urgency, less force, more clarity. Clarity is often misread as detachment, but it's the opposite. It's presence without panic. As people around her speculated about timelines, Caitlin stayed anchored in the now. She didn't correct assumptions. She didn't fuel curiosity. She allowed uncertainty to exist, understanding that not everything needs resolution immediately. That patience protected her from the most dangerous late-stage trap in sports. Forcing meaning. She didn't chase closure. She didn't frame moments as lasts. She didn't romanticize the idea of endings, because endings distort experience. And Caitlin wanted experience to remain honest. That honesty extended to how she thought about impact. She knew her influence would continue whether she stayed or stepped away. The culture she helped shape didn't depend on her constant presence anymore. That knowledge was freeing. It meant she didn't have to preserve anything artificially. She didn't have to stay longer than she wanted. She didn't have to leave sooner than she was ready. Timing would reveal itself. Until then, her role was simple. Show up fully. Stay grounded. Remain authentic. Those principles carried her through every phase so far, and they would guide her through transition when the moment arrived. And while the public searched for signs, Caitlyn stayed silent. Not because she had answers, but because she didn't need them yet. The most powerful transitions don't begin with declarations. They begin with peace. And Caitlyn Clark had found hers, long before anyone noticed. At some point, success stops feeling loud. Not because it disappears, but because it settles. That's where Caitlyn Clark found herself. Not chasing anything. Not running from anything. Just existing inside a version of her career that finally felt complete in ways the outside world couldn't measure. The noise had faded. The urgency had softened. The constant need to prove something had dissolved. What remained was peace. And peace is misunderstood in elite sports. People often confuse it with complacency. They assume calm means satisfied, and satisfied means finished. But peace doesn't mean the hunger is gone. It means the hunger no longer controls you. Caitlyn still competed, still prepared, still cared deeply about performance. But the stakes had changed internally. Wins didn't define her. Losses didn't shake her identity. The game had returned to something simple, something honest. She was playing because she loved it, not because she needed it. That shift reframed everything. Moments that once felt heavy now felt meaningful instead. Pressure didn't disappear. It became manageable. Expectations didn't vanish. They lost their power to dictate her worth. And that internal recalibration affected how others experienced her too. Fans noticed it in the way she carried herself. Less tension, less urgency, more presence. She didn't rush moments or force narratives. She let the game breathe. That breathing room mattered. Because in a culture obsessed with outcomes, Caitlyn demonstrated something rare: fulfillment without performance anxiety. She showed that excellence doesn't require constant struggle. That joy and discipline can coexist. That ambition doesn't have to be fueled by fear. That message resonated far beyond basketball. People watching her journey didn't just see a great athlete. They saw a model for sustainability, for showing up fully without sacrificing self, for achieving at the highest level without burning out publicly or privately. That reframing of success was subtle, but powerful. Winning wasn't just trophies or records anymore. It was endurance without erosion. It was influence without dominance. It was visibility without loss of identity. Caitlyn embodied all of it, not intentionally, but authentically. She never preached balance. She practiced it. And practice changes culture more than words ever could. As conversations around her career matured, so did the language people used. They stopped asking what she still needed to prove. They started talking about what she had already shown. Resilience, discipline, clarity. Those qualities became her real legacy markers. Because when the highlights fade, what remains is how someone made others feel about what was possible. Caitlyn made excellence feel attainable without self-destruction. She made composure feel powerful. She made restraint feel confident. That mattered, especially to younger players watching from the outside, wondering whether success always had to look chaotic. Caitlyn offered a different blueprint. One where growth didn't require constant reinvention, where fulfillment didn't require stepping away, where peace didn't require disappearance. She didn't redefine success with statements. She redefined it by living it. And that quiet redefinition carried weight. It softened the way people talked about pressure. It expanded the idea of leadership. It normalized the concept that winning can include well-being, not as a trade-off, but as a foundation. That shift won't show up in box scores, but it will show up in how the next generation approaches the game. And that's how you know influence has taken root. Not when people talk about you, but when they think differently because of you. Caitlyn Clark didn't just win games. She changed the emotional vocabulary of success. And that change will outlast any single season. Because peace, once modeled, becomes permission. Permission to compete fiercely without losing yourself. Permission to pursue greatness without chasing approval. Permission to define success on your own terms. That permission may be her most enduring contribution. And it sets the stage for the final reflection. Because once success is redefined, the only question left is how the story is remembered. Not by numbers, not by headlines, but by meaning. And that meaning was already taking shape. History doesn't remember careers the way they're lived. It remembers them the way they settle. Long after debates cool and opinions fade, what remains isn't the loudest argument or the most viral moment. It's the emotional residue, the feeling people associate with a name when time has had a chance to soften the edges. Caitlin Clark's story is already beginning that transformation. What once felt controversial now feels contextual. What once felt polarizing now feels layered. And what once felt urgent is slowly becoming reflective. That's how history works. It removes immediacy and leaves meaning. Years from now, people won't remember every argument about media attention or every online debate that tried to frame her success as something it wasn't. Those details will blur. What will remain is the arc, the rise, the pressure, the restraint, the endurance. History favors arcs over moments. And Caitlin's arc tells a story that resonates beyond sports. It's the story of someone who entered the spotlight faster than anyone expected and chose not to let that spotlight dictate who she became. Someone who absorbed attention without being consumed by it. Someone who understood that fame is temporary, but character leaves a longer shadow. That's what history notices. When future fans look back, they won't see Caitlin Clark as a headline or a controversy. They'll see her as a stabilizing force during a volatile era. A player who arrived when attention was fragmented and helped anchor it. A presence that made the game feel steady while everything around it was shifting. And that steadiness will matter more with distance. Because distance reveals contrast. When future generations compare eras, Caitlin's composure will stand out. Not because others lacked talent, but because she demonstrated how to hold talent without letting it distort identity. That lesson ages well. Memory tends to simplify stories, but Caitlin's resists simplification. She wasn't just dominant or just disciplined. She wasn't just quiet or just influential. She was layered, and layers survive scrutiny better than extremes. People will remember how she handled pressure without spectacle, how she avoided unnecessary conflict, how she refused to let her name be used for disrespect, how she stayed consistent when inconsistency was rewarded elsewhere. Those choices won't always make sense to people living in the moment, but they make perfect sense in hindsight. History also remembers tone, not just what someone achieved, but how they made people feel while achieving it. Caitlin's tone was calm in a culture that thrived on reaction. That calm didn't always satisfy, but it grounded the conversation over time. Grounding is rare, and rare traits are what history elevates. As years pass, highlights will be replayed, stats will be debated, records will be contextualized. But the deeper conversation will revolve around something harder to quantify. Presence. How it felt when she was on the court. How the atmosphere shifted. How attention focused without chaos. That feeling will become her signature. And once a feeling becomes associated with a name, that name transcends numbers. Caitlin Clark's story will likely be told very differently in the future than it is today. Not louder. Not more dramatic. Clearer. The debates that once surrounded her will be taught as growing pains of an evolving sport. The backlash will be framed as resistance to change rather than reflection of her character. And her restraint will be recognized as foresight rather than avoidance. That's how history redeems complexity. It waits until emotion fades. Then it tells the truth. And the truth of Caitlin Clark's journey is simple, even if the path wasn't. She didn't force greatness. She didn't demand reverence. She earned trust by staying herself long enough for others to catch up. That's what history will remember. Not who shouted the loudest, not who argued the hardest, but who remained intact. And in that sense, Caitlin Clark's legacy isn't finished, it's already secure. All that remains now is the closing reflection, the moment where the story steps back and asks the final question. What does this journey ultimately say about us? The audience, the culture, the moment. And that question leads us into the ending. When the noise finally fades, what's left is rarely what people argued about the most. It's what endured. Caitlin Clark's journey was never just about points, records, or attention. It was about how a person navigates pressure when the world refuses to look away. How someone carries expectations without letting them harden into armor. How restraint, in the long run, can be louder than reaction. At every stage, she was tested. First by hype, then by backlash, then by expectation, then by legacy. And at no point did she become what the moment demanded her to be. She didn't perform outrage when outrage was rewarded. She didn't overshare when access was demanded. She didn't force meaning when patience was harder. Instead, she stayed grounded, stayed disciplined, stayed human. That choice didn't always satisfy the internet. It didn't always end debates. But over time, it did something far more important. It It exposed how quickly we project, how often we confuse silence with weakness, how uncomfortable we become when someone refuses to play the role we've assigned them. Caitlin Clark never asked to be a symbol, but she became one anyway. Not of controversy, of composure. Not of dominance, of endurance. Not of perfection, of alignment. Her story reminds us that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, in the refusal to fracture under pressure, in the ability to let time, rather than reaction, tell the story. Years from now, when highlights are condensed and arguments forgotten, her journey will still matter. Not because of how loudly it was discussed, but because of how well it held up. And maybe that's the real takeaway. In a world addicted to immediacy, Caitlin Clark showed what it looks like to choose longevity. In a culture that rewards noise, she chose clarity. In moments that demanded reaction, she chose restraint. That kind of strength doesn't trend, but it lasts. And if you appreciate stories that go deeper than headlines, stories about pressure, identity, and what it really takes to stay yourself when everything is watching, then make sure you subscribe. Because we don't just follow moments here. We follow the stories that outlive them. Turn on notifications and stay with us for the next one.